Picture this. The government announces that the economy grew by 4% this year. Great news, right? But then you look around and your rent is higher. Your grocery bill has doubled, and your paycheck feels smaller than ever. Something doesn't add up. If everything's so great on paper, why does real life feel like it's sinking in sand? That's the paradox we're unpacking today, the illusion of growth that hides in plain sight. See, GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, is supposed to be the measure of a country's economic strength. It counts the total value of all goods and services produced within a nation's borders. Sounds simple enough, but it's actually a massive simplification. GDP doesn't distinguish between productive activity and harmful spending. If a hurricane destroys homes and rebuilding them boosts construction numbers, GDP goes up. If healthcare costs skyrocket because people are sick, GDP still goes up. Crazy, right? Governments love to flaunt GDP growth because it's like a single shiny number that suggests progress. It makes for great headlines. The economy is expanding, or our policies are working. But that single number hides layers of inequality, inefficiency, and sometimes even manipulation. Think of GDP like someone showing off their total cash flow without mentioning the mountain of debt behind it. The figure might look impressive, but it doesn't tell the full story. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The way GDP is measured gives governments plenty of room to play. For instance, when you change how you classify certain types of spending, you can make the economy look stronger without actually improving people's lives. Adding illegal drug trade estimates, yes, some countries actually do that, bumps up the GDP magically overnight. It's like adding imaginary toppings to a pizza and calling it larger. Ever noticed how those record-high GDP numbers often come right before elections? That's not a coincidence. Political cycles and data reporting cycles often dance together. When politicians need to prove that their economic policy works, manipulating how data is reported becomes a tempting option. Maybe they delay a revision until after the vote. Maybe they quietly redefine what counts as investment. It's not illegal most of the time, just creative. Now you might be thinking, but surely there are checks and balances, right? Well, in theory, yes. Independent statistical offices are supposed to prevent this kind of thing. But the truth is, those institutions are often under huge political pressure. Ministers call, budgets get cut, staff are replaced with friendly experts. In short, objectivity becomes negotiable. It's not always about lies. Sometimes it's about the right spin on a half-truth. Think about it this way. If you sell your car to your neighbor, GDP rises. But if you fix it yourself, nothing changes because no money exchanged hands. See the trick? GDP rewards monetary movement, not real productivity or well-being. So an economy can technically grow while its citizens get poorer. When that happens, we're no longer talking about prosperity, we're talking about illusion. Let's add a modern example. Suppose a government borrows billions to build new offices, roads, and stadiums right before an election. All that spending pumps up GDP. Yet that money isn't free. It comes from debt that someone will pay later, usually taxpayers like you. So the party in power gets the credit now, while the bill arrives years down the line. It's like celebrating a weight loss by tightening your belt instead of losing fat. Looks good in the mirror, disastrous afterwards. Companies do something similar with window dressing. That's when firms briefly alter their books to look healthier before showing them to investors. Governments have mastered that art too, except they do it on a national scale. Deferred spending, reclassified deficits, optimistic growth assumptions, the list goes on. These tactics don't fix underlying problems. They just change how those problems look. So let's ask the real question. Why should you care? Because GDP isn't just a number economists obsess over. It shapes policy, taxes, and everyday life. If GDP looks great, central banks might raise interest rates, making your loans or mortgage more expensive. If GDP looks weak, stimulus packages roll out that might increase inflation. In short, your wallet reacts to how this number dances. Now here's the catch. How GDP gets calculated can differ wildly across countries. Some nations include non-market activities like free digital services. Others ignore the informal economy completely. That's why comparing GDP between, say, the United States and Italy can be like comparing apples to cleverly disguised oranges. And yet, those comparisons drive global narratives about success. Here's an experiment. Next time you see a headline bragging about economic growth, ask yourself a few questions. Are wages keeping up? Are people happier? Is wealth distribution improving? If those answers are no, then that growth number might be just smoke and mirrors. Remember, when a few get richer but most get squeezed, GDP won't tell you who's holding the short end of the stick. Even the tech sector, which often drives modern GDP boosts, contributes to this illusion. When prices drop due to efficiency or digitalization, GDP might actually grow slower. Even though living standards improve, it's another twist of irony. Sometimes progress hides behind statistical shadows, and governments rarely highlight nuances that don't serve their story. But let's flip the coin. Not all GDP adjustments are malicious. Sometimes they reflect genuine modernization. When economies shift from manufacturing to digital services, old formulas struggle to capture new realities. Counting an app developer's output isn't as straightforward as counting cars or steel beams. Yet these gray zones make the whole system ripe for interpretation. And, well, creative interpretation is the unofficial national sport of politics. Still, the game has real consequences. When GDP is the only goal, environmental destruction, mental health issues, and social decay get ignored. Policies then chase headline growth instead of human progress. It's like celebrating the speed of a car without noticing it's heading straight for a wall. The gauges look good until they don't. And that's the heart of this chapter. Progress and prosperity aren't always the same. One can rise while the other falls. Governments know the majority judge their success through a handful of macro indicators. So if those indicators can be managed, so can public perception. And perception in politics is half the battle. In the next few chapters, we'll see how other key metrics, inflation and unemployment, are just as vulnerable to clever adjustments. Numbers don't just describe reality, they create it. A tweak here, a redefinition there, and suddenly the entire story changes. GDP is just the opening act in a much larger performance. Before we wrap up, let's bring it home to you. What would it mean if your country's economy grew while your purchasing power dropped? It would mean you're being told a partial truth, a story polished for comfort rather than accuracy. But once you recognize it as a story, not a fact, you can start asking better questions. And those questions? They're your best defense against being fooled by big, shiny numbers. So next time you hear a politician boast about record-breaking growth, take it with a pinch of skepticism. Ask yourself, growth for whom? Growth from what? Because behind that celebratory tone might hide a story of debt, inequality, or short-term political theater. The economy might be expanding on paper, but if your fridge looks emptier every month, the numbers are lying louder than words. And now that you see the trick, it'll be much harder for anyone to pull it off again. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You go to the supermarket, pick up the same bag of coffee you always buy, and suddenly it costs 50 cents more. You glance at your phone later, and the news proudly announces inflation is under control at 2%. Wait, what? That's when you realize those official numbers might not reflect your reality. Welcome to the strange, slippery world of inflation statistics, where the numbers may be accurate, but the story they tell isn't. Inflation, in theory, measures how much prices rise over time. It's supposed to capture how far your money stretches compared to last year. The main tool used for that is something called the basket of goods. Picture it like a shopping cart filled with everything an average household supposedly buys: food, clothing, housing, transportation, and a few nice-to-haves. Governments track how the total cost of that basket changes, and voila, that's your inflation rate. Sounds fair, right? Well, not exactly, because the tricky part is what goes inside that basket and who decides. By swapping out products, changing weights, or adjusting quality, statisticians can tame wild price increases into something more politically convenient. For example, if steak becomes too expensive, they might replace it with chicken, claiming people have switched preferences. It's called Substitution Effect. And while it sounds reasonable, it quietly hides the pain of rising costs. Let's say you used to buy a new smartphone for $600. A year later, the same brand releases a model with slightly better specs for $700. If the statisticians say that's a quality improvement, they adjust the price down, as if your extra $100 didn't really count. That process is called Hedonic Adjustment. Sounds fancy? It basically means you're paying more, but you're getting more, so stop complaining. Convenient, isn't it? Governments aren't always lying. They're reframing. And that's the big difference. Inflation numbers are technically correct within their own definitions, but those definitions are flexible. When politicians promise to keep inflation tame, they're also promising to manage its appearance. After all, stable prices make people feel safe, and feeling safe wins elections. When panic starts to spread, people run to protect their savings, sell assets, or vote differently. Controlling inflation narratives is really about controlling public mood. Let's pause for a second. Think about how you personally experience inflation. It's not from reading central bank reports or graphs. It's when your groceries get pricier, your bills go up, or your rent climbs faster than your salary. That's what economists call the cost of living gap. But that's exactly what official inflation underestimates. Because while your coffee, electricity, and Netflix go up, the basket might say overall prices are stable, thanks to some cheaper gadgets or fuel dropping a bit last quarter. Here's a fun twist. Tech products often deflate because they get better over time. So even if you pay more for that smartphone, the official measure may treat it as cheaper. Meanwhile, expensive essentials like housing, healthcare, or education weigh less in the basket. Which is odd, because those are the expenses that break real households. See the irony? The stuff you can't live without barely counts, but the stuff you replace once every few years gets maximum statistical attention. Now you might wonder, why not just calculate a real-world measure that reflects how people actually live? Some organizations try things like shadow inflation indexes or independent consumer data models. But governments prefer uniformity over accuracy. And more importantly, they need continuity. They want the graph to move smoothly, without shocking spikes that rattle the markets. Because when inflation jumps suddenly on paper, currencies lose credibility fast. So it's safer to smooth the data a bit. To understand the stakes, consider how powerful those inflation numbers are. Central banks use them to set interest rates. Politicians use them to adjust pensions, minimum wages, and public spending. Businesses use them when renegotiating contracts. Imagine the ripple effect. If inflation is reported 1 or 2 points lower than reality, millions of people lose value in their wages, savings, or benefits. But it all looks fine on paper. That's statistical magic, or deception, depending on where you stand. And then there's the psychological trick. People often accept official truths because they come in neat charts. We like clean, ordered data. It gives a sense of control. So when you see a number like 2.5%, your brain doesn't fight it. But when your fridge costs more to fill, something deep inside whispers, wait, that doesn't feel right. That's the conflict between lived experience and measured experience. The first you feel in your wallet, the second you see on your screen. Here's another layer few talk about: timeframes. The inflation you feel now might show up in data months later, if at all. Governments collect and adjust figures slowly, often with delays or revisions. That creates a lag that helps avoid panic, but also muddles accountability. By the time citizens realize inflation really hit them, elections are over, budgets are done, and narratives have moved on. The short memory of the public becomes part of the strategy. And let's not forget the role of asset inflation, the rise in prices of things like housing or stocks. Official inflation mostly ignores that, focusing on consumer goods instead. So when your rent doubles but your groceries stay the same, the index barely blinks. Yet for you, life feels twice as expensive. Politicians can then claim inflation is under control, even as an entire generation gets priced out of owning a home. It's one of the greatest statistical disconnects of modern economics. There's also a cultural dimension here. Countries have different ways of defining comfort. In some places, home ownership dominates the economic psyche. In others, food or energy security matters more. A basket built for a middle-class suburban family doesn't reflect a city renter or a rural worker. But guess what? They all live under the same national inflation rate. So while some barely notice price shifts, others drown under them, unseen by the aggregated data. Now, here's the clever part. When inflation underestimates reality, governments save money. Pensions and social benefits usually rise with official inflation figures. So if the government reports 3% instead of 5%, it quietly avoids spending billions. It's a soft cut disguised as stability. No angry protests, no debates, just a change in method. Numbers don't argue back. Of course, not all measurement changes are purely cynical. Technology really does alter consumption habits, and people adapt. There's a legitimate challenge in tracking progress without overreacting to every price bump. But this blurred boundary between modernization and manipulation keeps economists and citizens guessing. Where does fine-tuning end and propaganda begin? That's the subtle art of economic storytelling. The most ironic part? Inflation data doesn't only influence politics, it shapes financial markets. A lower than expected rate can send stock indexes soaring because it hints that central banks will keep interest rates low. A higher one can crash markets instantly. Investors hang on every decimal point as if it were divine truth. Yet behind that single number lies a patchwork of assumptions and adjustments. The perception of precision hides oceans of ambiguity. Let's bring this closer to home. Say your paycheck increases by 3% this year, while inflation officially is 2%. You're technically up 1%, right? But if your rent jumped by 8%, your groceries by 5%, and your electricity by 10%, you've effectively gotten poorer. You've lost purchasing power even though official data says you're fine. That's the hidden theft of understated inflation, a quiet erosion of real wealth. Some countries go further, outright denying inflationary trends. They impose price controls, censor stores, or even threaten businesses that raise prices too fast. The result? Empty shelves instead of high prices. Official data might stay pretty, but reality becomes chaos. It's the ultimate example of data manipulation backfiring. You can disguise numbers, but you can't change how people feel when their wallets scream. So what can you do as an informed citizen or investor? First, pay attention to how inflation is calculated in your country. Read what goes into that basket and how often it's updated. Second, follow independent sources, budgets, and cost of living studies. Third, trust your own experience. If everything feels more expensive, that's your real inflation rate, not some sanitized government figure buried in a PDF. The truth is personal, not statistical. So the next time inflation feels worse than they admit, you're not crazy, you're paying attention. That quiet scrape at the checkout line, The shrinking portions, the rent hikes, they don't lie. Numbers, however, can dance across screens in neat harmony while reality burns slowly underneath. Inflation is supposed to be a thermometer of the economy. But when governments fiddle with the scale, you stop measuring heat and start measuring trust. And trust, once broken, is far harder to repair than any price index will ever admit. Let's play a game. Imagine you wake up one morning to the news anchor cheerfully announcing, "Unemployment has hit record lows." You sip your coffee, scroll through job listings, and still see friends posting about layoffs and endless job hunts. Something doesn't match. How can unemployment be falling if no one seems to be getting hired? That disconnect is the beating heart of this chapter. The great illusion of the disappearing worker. Unemployment sounds easy to define, right? It's the number of people without a job. Except, no. In reality, it's the number of people without a job who are actively looking for one. The moment you stop searching, congratulations, you vanish from the statistics. You're no longer part of the labor force. That's the loophole that transforms a struggling job market into a statistical success story. This little trick is everywhere. Governments and statistical agencies classify people as either employed, unemployed, or out of the labor force. Guess which group looks the best when times are tough? Exactly, the last one. If you're too discouraged to keep looking, or if you take a temporary gig just to survive, you no longer count as unemployed. Presto, the unemployment rate improves without a single new job being created. Economists call it discouraged worker effect. Sounds clinical, doesn't it? But behind that phrase sits a lot of quiet frustration. Now picture an economy coming out of a crisis. New jobs are scarce, but the headlines say, "Unemployment drops again." Politicians celebrate, the markets cheer, and yet wages stay flat. What actually happened is that thousands gave up searching because they lost hope. It's like sweeping dust under the rug. The room looks cleaner, but the dirt hasn't gone anywhere. The illusion works because people trust percentages, not definitions. Let's break down how this gets calculated. The labor force participation rate is the share of working-age people actually working or seeking work. When that number drops, it's a red flag. People are leaving the game. But if the official reporters ignore that decline and only highlight the shrinking unemployment rate, they can paint a rosy picture. Fewer participants, fewer problems. Simple math, misleading story. This isn't even new. Back in the late 20th century, several countries began revising how they counted employment. Part-time and temporary jobs started being grouped as fully employed. So if you work 2 days a week stacking shelves or doing delivery, congratulations again, you're employed. Never mind that you can't pay rent or build a stable life. On paper, labor markets look solid. In practice, underemployment quietly spreads. And here's another twist. What exactly counts as a job keeps evolving. The rise of the gig economy has blurred the line between employment and self-employment. Driving for an app or freelancing a few hours here and there technically counts as being employed. But what if you earn less than a full-time wage or have no benefits? The statistic doesn't care. In the digital economy, even precarious hustle looks like progress. You can see why this system benefits politicians. High employment numbers signal competence, stability, and growth. They reassure investors and calm voters, but it's a fragile illusion built on definitions that exclude the uncounted. When entire groups vanish from the data, students, caregivers, retirees forced out early, the picture turns selectively optimistic. Reality looks filtered through a politician's camera lens. Think of the unemployment rate as a photo cropped too tightly. Zoom out and you'd see a different story. Millions of part-timers, gig workers, and underpaid employees struggling to make ends meet. But the official frame stops just before they appear. It's not technically lying, it's just an artful omission. And like any good magic trick, it works best when the audience doesn't ask what's behind the curtain. To drive this home, let's run a simple thought experiment. Imagine a country of 100 people. 10 lose their jobs and search for months. Eventually, 5 stop looking out of sheer exhaustion. The government now counts only 5 as unemployed. Overnight, unemployment drops from 10% to 5%, even though not one new job was created. See how that works? The numbers improved because hope declined. But this subtle manipulation doesn't stop there. Some nations use what's called a headline unemployment rate. It measures only the most active job seekers. Others use broader measures that include discouraged workers and part-timers. When politicians boast about the lowest unemployment in decades, they always refer to the narrowest version. When you compare countries, make sure you're comparing apples with apples, not apples with invisible oranges. Let's not forget another favorite trick: government programs that push people temporarily off the unemployment rolls. Retraining programs, early retirements, public hiring sprees before elections. Each reduces the visible unemployed population. Once the numbers are published, funding quietly fades or contracts expire. But the celebratory headlines remain. Timing is everything when your career depends on quarterly statistics. Even beyond politics, there's a cultural factor. Societies hate the idea of wasted potential. So by redefining who counts as unemployed, governments maintain a narrative of productivity. Everyone's busy. Everyone contributing. Yet you can feel the truth on the streets. Overcrowded cafes full of people working on laptops, juggling side gigs, waiting for something stable. It's a generation in limbo, statistically invisible but economically essential. There's also the psychological side. People tend to blame themselves when they can't find work. So when the unemployment rate drops and they're still jobless, it feels like a personal failure. That's an incredibly effective way to neutralize discontent. Turn structural issues into private guilt. The official numbers no longer just inform the public. They shape how individuals see their own worth. Now, to be fair, measuring unemployment is genuinely complex. Economies evolve, technology changes, and so do people's working habits. Some flexibility in definitions is necessary. But the ethical problem arises when those changes conveniently benefit one group, usually those in power. Data should illuminate reality, not disguise it. A sound economy can handle bad news. A fragile one cannot, so it hides behind adjusted figures. Let's talk about the role of statistical agencies. In many nations, they're technically independent, but budgets and leadership appointments often depend on the government. When a president or minister publicly criticizes unemployment data as too negative, bureaucrats take note. It's rarely direct censorship, more like subtle incentives. Produce friendlier numbers, and your department earns praise, stability, maybe a bigger budget next year. Integrity becomes negotiable. We also can't ignore the role of automation. As machines replace jobs, fewer people are needed for the same level of output. That means GDP rises while employment falls. But policymakers rarely emphasize that link. They'll highlight higher productivity, not lost livelihoods. Over time, whole industries transform without an honest discussion of where those displaced workers go. The data reclassifies them out of existence. Consider long-term unemployment. If you've been jobless for more than a year, the odds are stacked against you. Many statistical systems eventually stop counting you altogether. Official reports say, long-term unemployment down. But that's often because job seekers timed out of the dataset. It's bureaucracy masquerading as progress. And the longer it persists, the more detached from reality those numbers become. We've also seen the introduction of alternative employment measures like the employment-to-population ratio. That number counts how many working-age individuals actually have jobs, without filtering out discouraged workers. It's usually far less flattering, which is why you almost never hear politicians use it in speeches. It's the real pulse of the labor market, but it ruins the story of optimism they work so hard to sell. When job markets seem strong on paper but fragile in real life, society pays a steep price. Economic policy gets built on illusions. Central banks adjust interest rates thinking employment is high, even when most of those jobs are precarious. The media reports a boom, and consumers get overconfident, taking on more debt. Then, when the next slowdown hits, everyone acts surprised. But the warning signs were hiding in plain sight. In the definitions themselves, there's also a generational dimension. Young people often bounce between temporary gigs and internships before landing stable employment. But those stints still count as employed. Meanwhile, older workers forced into early retirement disappear from the stats entirely. The real story of who wins and who loses in the labor market gets buried beneath the neat simplicity of a percentage point. Let's be clear. A low unemployment rate isn't inherently bad news. It's just incomplete. On its own, it tells you nothing about job quality, income security, or future prospects. Governments may treat it like the ultimate proof of success. But for real people, it's the beginning of the story, not the end. Understanding that disconnect is key to seeing through the fog of economic propaganda. Imagine how different public debate would be if every government report included underemployment, people who want more hours or better pay but can't get them. That figure is often double or even triple the official unemployment rate. But since it paints a less flattering picture, it stays buried in the footnotes. The fewer unpleasant truths people see, the longer confidence holds. Confidence keeps economies running, until it doesn't. So, what can you take away from this? The next time you hear about record low unemployment, resist the instinct to cheer immediately. Ask how many workers are part-time, how many have given up, how many are hustling just to stay afloat. Those are the real indicators of economic health. Numbers can tell any story you want. All you need is the right definition. At the end of the day, employment statistics are less about people and more about narrative control. The smaller the number, the bigger the applause. But step outside the spreadsheet and you'll find an economy full of contradictions. People overqualified for their jobs, freelancers one invoice away from crisis, and skilled workers unable to find stable positions. It's not a labor shortage, it's a truth shortage. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this pattern repeats itself in GDP manipulation, the creative accounting governments use to display prosperity, even when the foundation is cracking. But before we move on, keep this thought in mind. Real progress doesn't fear honest data. When workers disappear from statistics, it's not because they stopped existing. It's because someone decided their story didn't fit the narrative. And when that happens, it's not just numbers that get lost, it's people. Let's play with an idea that governments absolutely love: creative accounting. You've probably heard of companies cooking their books right before an earnings report. Well, nations do the same thing, just on a much grander scale. They dress up their gross domestic product numbers like a car salesman shines a used vehicle. Fresh coat of paint, shiny rims, and suddenly, everyone believes it's brand new. But peek under the hood, and you might discover a sputtering engine. Here's the trick. GDP measures how much an economy produces. Goods, services, investments, and government spending all rolled together. Growth in GDP means prosperity, supposedly. But the way those numbers are calculated isn't sacred scripture. It's a system full of judgment calls. Governments can tweak definitions, delay revisions, or rewrite how spending gets counted. One tiny change in classification can turn a slow economy into a so-called miracle. Think about this. When a country spends more on defense projects, it immediately boosts GDP. Tanks, uniforms, and infrastructure all count as productive investment. Peaceful years? Lower GDP. Strange, isn't it? Building bombs adds growth, but building stability doesn't. You can see why politicians love to ramp up spending when numbers need a lift. The economy looks busier, even if what's being built doesn't actually make anyone richer. But the most fascinating part of this magic act is in the timing. GDP data doesn't just appear, it comes in waves. There's the initial flash estimate, then later revisions, and sometimes massive restatements months or even years later. When governments want good press before an election, they lean heavily on those early optimistic numbers. Bad revisions? Well, those can wait until the new administration comes in. It's not lying, it's selective truth-telling. One of the easiest ways to artificially boost GDP is through public debt. Borrow heavily, spend quickly, and watch the statistics soar. New highways, government projects, subsidies, all boost GDP today. The bill comes later. It's like maxing out your credit card, buying a new TV, and bragging to your neighbors about how your household spending grew 5%. On paper, true. In lifestyle, disaster waiting to happen. Now let's talk about inflation adjustment, a more subtle maneuver. Nominal GDP measures raw growth, while real GDP adjusts for inflation. By choosing a deflator, essentially a multiplier that accounts for price changes, statisticians can make growth look healthier or weaker. A slightly lower inflation estimate magically lifts real GDP. It's like switching units from pounds to kilograms to sound lighter. The mass doesn't change, but perception does. Then we've got seasonal adjustments. Economies behave differently depending on the time of year. Holidays, harvests, weather patterns. Adjusting for those fluctuations makes sense, but it also creates wiggle room. A temporary dip becomes a technical irregularity. Ministers can shrug and say, "Next quarter will rebound." And guess what? If it doesn't rebound, the previous numbers quietly get revised upward later. Crisis postponed, applause secured. Let's pull the curtain back even more. Data collection itself can be redesigned. Governments might expand or shrink sample sizes, change base years, or alter how industries are grouped. Each small tweak shifts results just enough to make comparisons difficult. Suddenly, the new GDP series reflects modern realities, meaning it conveniently makes growth appear faster and a recession shorter. Old data doesn't lie. It just becomes obsolete. Think of corporate restatements when you hear about revised GDP figures. Companies sometimes find extra revenue thanks to accounting changes. Countries do it too. In one famous case, a small European nation revised its GDP upward by nearly 25% overnight. Did everyone suddenly start working harder? No. The statisticians just decided to include certain financial activities previously left out. Political bragging rights instantly secured. At the heart of all this is incentive. Politicians live and die by economic performance indicators. A rising GDP flatters leadership, boosts consumer confidence, and signals to investors that all is well. When GDP falls, so does trust, investment, and electoral support. That's why governments bend over backward, sometimes literally, to make sure growth stays visible, even if it's smoke and mirrors. You can't campaign on a recession. The relationship between GDP and reality gets even stranger when you factor in inequality. A billionaire buying a new yacht boosts GDP as much as thousands of modest purchases by regular citizens. But the distribution doesn't matter in those numbers. As long as money flows somewhere, the total looks healthy. That's how a country can have rising GDP and falling living standards simultaneously. Growth doesn't mean prosperity, it just means transactions. Now, let's add the international angle. GDP comparisons are a global popularity contest. When one country boasts higher growth than its neighbors, it attracts investors and bragging rights. But exchange rates, tax policy tricks, and statistical timing can distort those comparisons too. One country may include certain military exports, another might not. One revises quarterly, another annually. Global competition meets statistical theater. You might be wondering, is there a more honest way to measure progress? Economists have been debating that for decades. Alternatives like the Human Development Index or measures of well-being factor in education, health, and life satisfaction. But those don't make for easy campaign slogans. GDP up 3% sounds decisive. Citizen happiness improved slightly doesn't pack the same punch. So the numbers most useful to people rarely make headlines. Let's revisit debt for a second, because that's where creative GDP gets especially dangerous. When growth is fueled by deficits, it's not sustainable. Governments pretend they're generating wealth, but they're just shifting tomorrow's burden onto today's metrics. It's like painting a rusted bridge to make it look new instead of fixing the steel. The shine fools everyone until the first crack appears, and by then, it's too late. Another hidden trick is rebasing. Every few years, statistical agencies choose a new base year for their GDP calculations. Let's say the base year was 20 years ago, when phones, cloud computing, or crypto didn't exist. Updating the base makes sense, but it often results in jumpy, convenient growth spikes. The narrative becomes, our economy is modernizing, when it's really just redefining what gets measured. A bureaucratic facelift, nothing more. So who catches these sleights of hand? Usually, no one outside data nerds and global institutions. The average citizen sees the growth headline and assumes experts know what they're doing. Critics might call out inconsistencies, but the technical complexity is enough to drown debate. Numbers carry authority, and that authority protects them from scrutiny. But remember, even the smartest data can't hide a shrinking paycheck. Now picture a politician standing at a podium. Behind them, a chart shows a nice upward slope. The audience claps, cameras flash, investors smile. In that moment, perception is more powerful than truth. The same growth that looks heroic might later be restated downward, but the emotional impact lingers. You don't need accuracy to win votes, just good timing and better lighting. Global institutions also play the game, though with slightly different motives. International organizations use GDP as the main metric for loans, rankings, and influence. So countries have every reason to inflate numbers just enough to appear creditworthy. It's not just vanity, it's access to funding. A few extra billion in GDP can mean better credit terms, larger loans, or a seat at an exclusive table. Manipulation becomes part of strategy. Here's the big irony. GDP starts as a neutral tool, a basic thermometer for economic activity. But once it becomes a symbol of power, everyone wants to hold the thermometer in their own hand. Rewriting definitions becomes rewriting destiny. And each revision, no matter how small, pushes the real economy further from the reported one. You can only blur a picture so long before even the blurred lines start to fade. So, what's the cost of creative accounting? Confidence. Investors stop believing. Citizens lose trust. Markets get skittish when revision after revision reveals embellishment. And once that confidence collapses, recovery takes years. Numbers are supposed to clarify, not deceive. When they become theater, the curtain eventually falls. What should you, as a viewer and a citizen, take away from all this? Treat GDP announcements like weather forecasts, informative but not gospel. Ask what kind of growth it is. Is it driven by debt, speculation, or genuine productivity? Who benefits from it? And most importantly, what's being left out of the story? Real progress leaves footprints across society. Fake progress leaves only headlines. In the next chapter, we'll expose why politicians love pretty numbers so much they're willing to gamble the future on them. Because behind every creative spreadsheet lies a deeper truth. Numbers don't just describe policy, they sell it. And in the global marketplace of belief, The most valuable product isn't growth itself. It's the illusion of control. Let's get straight to it. Politicians love pretty numbers because pretty numbers tell pretty stories. Stories get votes, confidence, and headlines. Nothing calms a jittery public faster than a chart pointing upward. It doesn't matter if the story behind it is half-truth or creative illusion. What matters is that people believe things are fine. In politics, perception beats precision every single time. Imagine standing at a podium during an election year. You've got skyrocketing prices, falling wages, and restless citizens. But then your team of economic magicians hands you a stat sheet. Unemployment is at an all-time low. GDP grew above expectations. Inflation is under control. You don't even need to lie. You just choose which version of the truth to spotlight. Congratulations, you've turned economic chaos into a victory speech. Think about the role of public confidence. When citizens believe the economy is growing, they spend more freely. They take on mortgages, loans, and new projects. That spending fuels actual growth. The illusion becomes partially real. But when people lose faith, they tighten their belts, businesses shrink, and the numbers follow downward. In short, the belief in stability creates stability until the first crack appears. This is what economists call narrative economics, the art of storytelling disguised as policy. Politicians craft these narratives carefully, weaving data points into tales of progress, recovery, or resilience. A good narrative can outlive any fact sheet. Remember how quickly everyone forgot those temporary slowdowns or technical recessions? That's narrative management at work, controlling the emotional temperature of an entire country with selective data. Let's take an example. Suppose a government faces rising unemployment. Instead of admitting failure, it redefines part-time jobs as full employment or removes certain groups from the labor force count. Voila! Unemployment drops overnight. A press conference follows. The minister beams. Markets rally. None of it improves anyone's life, but the numbers work their charm. The story wins the day, and the truth moves to the footnotes. Another favorite strategy is reframing growth. Imagine GDP growing by 1% after an expensive public spending spree. You call it proof of resilience and responsible investment. If GDP shrinks the next quarter, you call it a technical adjustment. It's the same economy, just packaged differently. The public hears optimism, the markets hear reassurance, and critics sound like pessimists standing in the way of progress. Let's not forget how international competition amplifies the incentive to beautify data. Countries compare themselves relentlessly, whose economy is fastest, whose unemployment is lowest. Political prestige depends on being above average, and that creates pressure to polish the mirror just enough. Nobody wants to be the underperformer in a world that treats GDP rankings like Olympic medals. But behind every massaged number lies a moral question. Should citizens be treated like children who can't handle bad news? Should governments smooth rough edges to avoid panic? Many leaders would answer yes. They'd argue that controlling perception prevents irrational reactions, stock crashes, bank runs, social unrest, and they're not entirely wrong. The problem is that reality always catches up, and by the time it does, trust is already gone. The media plays a starring role in this theater. Headlines love clean, simple numbers. Inflation down. Growth surges. Deficit improves. These stories are easy to sell and easy to digest. Few journalists have time or incentive to dig into statistical methodology. So press releases become gospel, and the public eats it up. A misleading statistic can travel around the world before serious analysis even wakes up. Now you might think this is just political spin, but the consequences reach deep into policy. When governments decorate their data, they also misallocate resources, believing unemployment is low. Then there's less urgency to invest in job training, believing inflation is under control. No need to raise wages or adjust pensions. Policy decisions built on distorted statistics often make the real situation worse. This cycle creates what some call statistical populism. It's not about ideology. It's about manipulating numbers to maintain popularity. Right, left, liberal, conservative. It doesn't matter. The math bends for anyone chasing votes, and once the manipulation starts, it's hard to stop, because revealing the truth later would expose the earlier deception. It's a self-perpetuating system built on selective transparency. Let's consider debt as an example. When politicians promise balanced budgets, they often hide future liabilities, unpaid pensions, public guarantees, off-book expenses. On paper, everything looks disciplined. In reality, it's a ticking time bomb. When the truth finally surfaces, the correction is brutal. Austerity, layoffs, tax hikes. The same citizens who once applauded the fiscal responsibility pay the price for believing in fictional balance sheets. Why is this approach so effective? Because humans are wired for hope. We crave positive momentum, even if it's artificial. Politicians know that good economic news buys time and goodwill, and in politics, time is priceless. A few months of optimism can carry an election, even if the house burns down a year later. The reward happens now. The cost lands on the next administration. The dangerous part is how this culture seeps into institutions. Once statistical manipulation becomes normalized, civil servants stop questioning it. Adjustments become traditions, not scandals. Entire bureaucracies learn to produce results that align with expectations rather than facts. By the time someone asks for transparency, the original data is buried beneath layers of revisions and bureaucratic jargon. There's also an emotional component for leaders themselves. Imagine working years on economic policy. You've made tough calls, cut budgets, and faced protests. When the data still looks bleak, it's tempting to tweak the narrative, just a little, to show results. It's not just deception of others. It's self-deception. Politicians convince themselves that adjusting data is harmless if it protects the greater good. That moral justification opens the floodgates. And yes, citizens play along because they want to believe. When you hear your country is a rising powerhouse or the envy of Europe, it feels good. Even if your salary says otherwise, the national narrative gives pride. People tolerate hardship more easily if they think it's temporary. Governments exploit this patience by stretching temporary into forever. The myth of progress becomes a national drug. Eventually, though, the numbers stop cooperating. The gap between data and daily life grows too wide. When public frustration hits boiling point, when the job market feels fake and the cost of living unbearable, trust implodes. Statistical lies only work in times of mild pain, not existential crisis. Once reality breaks the illusion, even accurate reports start sounding suspicious. The credibility system implodes from overuse. Internationally, this creates another loop. When one nation pretties up its data, others feel pressure to follow. Nobody wants to admit they're doing worse than a neighbor who's massaging the metrics. This silent arms race distorts global reports and policy comparisons. Suddenly, everyone's growing faster, exporting more, and managing inflation like geniuses, until the dominoes start falling. So, can this cycle be broken? Only by changing what we value. Instead of worshiping single indicators like GDP or unemployment, societies could measure quality of life, access to opportunity, and sustainability. But those metrics are messy. They don't make for applause lines. They require honesty, patience, and humility. 3 traits politicians rarely get elected for. Still, change begins with awareness, and you're already halfway there. At the end of the day, pretty numbers don't fix problems. They postpone them. Every glossed-over statistic is a bill deferred to the future, economic, social, or moral. And when that bill arrives, it's always more expensive. The irony is that by protecting short-term image, leaders destroy long-term trust, which is the foundation of genuine growth. Confidence built on illusion is the most fragile kind. So next time you hear a politician brag about record growth, pause. Ask yourself who benefits from that statement. Is it a genuine achievement or a staged performance? Because behind every polished percentage point, there's a human story, one of struggle, compromise, or omission. Numbers might win elections, but truth wins endurance. And when the math finally stops adding up, the prettiest numbers turn into the ugliest consequences. So here we are, after peeling away layer after layer of polished statistics, friendly charts, and shiny government reports. You've seen how GDP, inflation, and unemployment all can be bent, stretched, or sugar-coated. And now it's time to ask the real question. What can you, as a curious citizen or investor, actually do about it? This chapter is not about shouting conspiracy. It's about understanding how to see through the fog that official numbers create, how to read between the lines of data that shapes your life, your savings, and your future decisions. Let's start with a universal principle. Statistics are not reality. They are summaries of it. They simplify the chaos of millions of transactions, habits, and choices into neat percentages. That simplification always leaves something out. Sometimes what's left out is intentional. Sometimes it's just a side effect of wanting to turn the economy into a single graph. Either way, if you treat numbers like gospel, you give up your ability to question them. Another sign of creative storytelling is when multiple statistics move in opposite directions. If GDP is up but household income is down, or if unemployment is low but labor participation is shrinking, the picture doesn't fit. Real economies move like ecosystems. When one part thrives while the rest feels pain, something is being hidden. That's when you pull out your metaphorical magnifying glass. Or, more realistically, read the details in the footnotes that journalists usually skip. To the untrained eye, official reports look like neutral documents. But to those who read carefully, they reveal priorities and incentives. Look at what gets highlighted in the executive summary, and what gets buried deep in appendices. If the story emphasizes percentage growth but avoids talking about median outcomes, you have your answer. It's a presentation exercise, not a reflection of life. Real data doesn't fear context. It invites it. Now, none of this means official statistics are useless. Far from it, they're invaluable as long as you remember what they are. Snapshots, not the full movie. The trick lies in comparing them with your own observations. If inflation supposedly runs at 2%, but your electricity, rent, and groceries jumped by double digits, the dissonance tells you more than the report ever will. Trust the pattern of your life before the rhetoric of a spreadsheet. One powerful tool you can use is cross-verification. Don't rely on a single number to tell the story. Check wage growth versus productivity, employment data versus labor participation, consumer confidence versus savings rates. When the headlines say everything is booming but citizens are cutting back spending, you've found a red flag. Economies, after all, are built by people, not by press releases. Let's talk psychology for a second, because it's central to this whole mess. Statistics shape feelings, and feelings shape behavior. When governments publish calm inflation numbers, it's not just to inform you, it's to influence you. If you believe things are stable, you act stable. You slow down panic spending, avoid massive withdrawals, and keep paying taxes quietly. So remember, every graph you see serves both an analytical and an emotional function. The numbers are tools of persuasion as much as reflection. That doesn't mean governments are always malicious. Often, they just fear chaos more than dishonesty. If people panic, economies crash. If people stay calm, the system survives even when it's limping. That's why leaders sometimes prefer a slightly polished version of the truth. Their calculus is pragmatic. Better a stable illusion than a volatile reality. But eventually, illusions compound into crises. It's only a matter of when, not if. As an investor, or simply as someone who wants to protect their purchasing power, your mission is to think independently. Look for patterns governments rarely highlight: surging debt levels, central bank balance sheets, widening inequality, demographic shifts. Those tell you where an economy is truly heading. Don't fixate on quarterly GDP noise. Focus on long-term structures. Growth driven by debt and subsidies doesn't last. Growth based on innovation and productivity does. Another practical habit: compare official optimism with business confidence surveys. When companies and households express caution while government reports show sunshine, that's a divergence worth noticing. The private sector often senses trouble months before the data catches up. You don't need insider contacts. You just need to cross-check sentiment against state messaging. Disagreement between the two usually means the headlines are one step behind reality. History offers plenty of reminders that pretty data can coexist with looming disaster. Before financial crises, bubbles and recessions, governments almost always reported growth. The statistics lag because they describe yesterday's success while ignoring tomorrow's risk. It's like tracking your health based on last week's selfies. Flattering, yet meaningless. By the time official numbers admit the truth, the damage is already done. So how can you make sense of it all without falling into cynicism? First, accept that all economic data has bias, not necessarily political, but structural. Measurements reflect what their creators valued at the time they were designed. GDP, for example, was built for an industrial age, not a digital one. Inflation baskets assume stable consumption patterns that no longer exist. Understanding their design limits helps you see when data stops matching modern life. Second, learn to question outliers. When something feels too good or too bad to be true, it usually is. Real economies rarely skyrocket or collapse overnight. Those movements signal either sudden changes in measurement or manipulated baselines. Be suspicious of the extraordinary. Both miracles and catastrophes make excellent political theater. Numbers that fit too neatly into campaign slogans deserve extra scrutiny. Next, always look for revisions. First releases of GDP or inflation are just guesses based on limited data. They nearly always change. The problem is that politicians use first releases for public relations, but never highlight when revisions later reveal the truth. Once you realize this timing trick, the illusion weakens. Headlines brag about success, while the corrections drift quietly into the archives. Another layer worth watching is international validation. Independent institutions often cross-check government data for consistency. If a country claims soaring growth, but its trade partners report falling imports or exports, something doesn't align. Likewise, if satellite data or energy consumption contradicts official industrial output, there's your red flag. It's harder to fake the flow of electricity than the content of a report. But let's not stop at skepticism. Awareness should lead to empowerment. When you learn to decode statistics, you gain back control. You stop reacting like a spectator and start thinking like a participant. The economy stops being an abstract force and becomes a system of incentives you can navigate. That's the difference between fear and literacy. Economic literacy breaks the spell of manipulated narratives. You don't need to be an economist to sense when things don't add up. You just need curiosity and memory. Pay attention to how official stories evolve with time. Do today's promises contradict last year's excuses? Are long-term challenges repackaged as temporary issues every election cycle? Spot the patterns, because they repeat with clockwork precision. The technology changes, but the storytelling doesn't. Still, there's a constructive side to all this. Data can be reclaimed. When citizens, journalists, and analysts demand transparency, governments eventually adapt. Open databases, citizen audits, and alternative indicators grow stronger when people care. The more eyes on the numbers, the harder it becomes to twist them. Healthy skepticism isn't rebellion. It's maintenance, the civic duty of demanding that reality stay visible. Now here comes the empowering part. Every decision you make, what to buy, where to save, whether to change jobs, depends on how accurately you perceive your surroundings. The goal isn't to distrust everything, it's to trust intelligently. Accept that no number is sacred, but patterns don't lie forever. Over time, truth leaks through cracks in the facade. And those who read between the lines move ahead of the herd. Before closing, take a moment to appreciate the irony. The same governments that manipulate data do so because people care deeply about those numbers. If no one paid attention, there'd be no reason to hide the truth. In the end, this obsession with appearances reveals something oddly human, our collective need for reassurance. The system mirrors our own fear of uncertainty. Recognizing that helps you forgive, but not forget. So as we come to the end of this journey, remember what you've learned. Statistics are stories told with numbers, and every storyteller has motives. GDP can rise while inequality deepens. Inflation can look tame while wallets empty, and unemployment can fall while despair grows. Once you know the tricks, you can't unsee them, but that's good. It means you've stepped outside the matrix of blind trust. And now, when you hear the next confident announcement about economic growth, you'll smile knowingly. You'll listen, nod politely, and then check the details that no one mentions. Because real empowerment doesn't come from believing the story. It comes from decoding it. Keep asking, keep reading between the lines, and never confuse the story of prosperity with the experience of it. True understanding doesn't start with numbers. It starts with curiosity.